Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Open University.
Welcome back to Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University for MA English program, and we are discussing translation theory, and specifically we are looking at translation theory given by Roman Jackobson in his very famous essay Linguistic Aspects of Translation. And in the previous two classes we have discussed how Jackobson moves beyond the conventional understanding of translation as synonymy between two words, and he points out how to at the level of two words exact synonymy is not possible even in the same language. And then he formulates a semiotic theory of translation based on theories of Ferdinand de Saussure and of Charles Sanders Peirce to formulate his own theory of translation, where he defines translation as an act of semiotic explication to higher order of understanding and interpretation, right. So, bachelor is explained as unmarried man, and that is an example of what he calls intra-linguistic translation, where you are explaining the science in one language with the science in another in the same language, sorry, that is bachelor is explained as unmarried man. So, this is an example of intralingual translation. He talks about two other ways of explaining and understanding science. Second is using another language to understand science, right, which he calls interlingual translation, and third is intersemiotic translation, which means that you can communicate a message in one language in non-verbal way as well. It may be through musical performance, it may be through painting, right, and the whole activity of interpretation and explication in another science system, non-verbal science system, is very important when we look at cinematic adaptations of literary text, right. So, if you have seen the films based on novels by J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter films, then these are an example of intersemiotic translations, something which he calls transmutation. You can also look at poems written on paintings or work of art, right, a genre called ekphrasis, right. So, ekphrastic poems like say for example Ode to Grecian Urn by John Keats or Musée des Beaux-Arts by W.H. Auden. These are examples of ekphrasis, which means you are using language to interpret something which is non-verbal in form of artwork like painting or a poem or a sculpture, right. So, you can see that Jacobson's framework helps us to understand translation in such a broad way that our entire culture can be brought under the umbrella of translation, right. So, you can look at games based on literary text as intersemiotic translations, right. You can look at paintings made on music, right. For example, in medieval Indian period you had paintings based on raga, something called ragamala painting, right. So, you would have a particular rag and there would be a painting based on that rag, or paintings based on Ramayana and Mahabharata, for example. All these are examples of intersemiotic translation, right. So, you can see how broad the definition of translation is. When you are explaining something to your friend in the same language, you are doing intralingual translation, right. So, he uses this framework to critique the idea of linguistic relativism, and which can be found in the theory of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which says that language determines our perception of reality rather than other way round. So, those languages which have different structures will perceive the world differently. So, the idea of linguistic relativism entails that translation is not possible, right. So, what you are basically saying in Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf's framework is that communication that happens in one language cannot be communicated in another language, and Jackobson is arguing that this is not the case, and translation and communication between languages can always happen. And he gives several examples, and one of the example was grammatical gender, right. For example, in Gujarati, Chand is masculine, while in English it is feminine. So, but that does not prevent us from understanding what is meant by the word moon. So, the particular features of a language do not become an obstacle in cross cultural communication, right. It may be sorted out by circumlocutions, semantic shifts, loan words and loan borrowings and neologism, coining new words, and so on and so forth, right. That always happens. For example, we commonly use the word table for mage, right, in Gujarati. We do not use word mage very often, we use word table. Now, that is we have borrowed that word from English, but that has become part of Gujarati. So, many English words in Gujarati and Hindi are forms of these adaptations and borrowings, which become part of that language, right. Okay. So, these two ideas that we discuss in 2 lectures are extremely seminal intervention in study of translation and cross cultural communication, and these aspects are so important for the globalized world, right, because in the globalized world, as the world shrinks because of media and new media, there is always a need to overcome linguistic barriers. So, cross cultural communication becomes one of the most important problems of modern society, and for that Jackobson's theory is of great help. So, in this class, what are we going to do as we bring the discussion to an end is look at how other scholars develop these ideas by Roman Jackobson, came up with their own theories, and also critique or criticize Jackobson, right, and his framework. So, we will discuss the kind of legacy or aftermath of Jacobsonian approach in this last lecture. So, if you remember, what we discussed was that Jacobson's framework belongs to something called formalism, right, and formalism implies that form is more important than content. Form is primary, and form is everything that you need to study when you study literature, and they would argue that literariness is the object of literature, not literary texts. So, formalists go on to make a distinction between literary use of language and non-literary use of language, which is at the heart of formalist understanding of art, right. So, this binary between literary and non-literary, poetic and non-poetic is a problematic one, but that will be is something that is we have to bear in mind as we look at the legacy of Roman Jakobson. So, the later scholars like Michael Raffater, Umberto Eco, Yuri Lotman, and philosophers like Jacques Derrida have questioned the underlying metaphysical and theoretical assumption in Jackobson's writing in his deconstructive reflections on translation, something that we will just briefly touch upon, given that these are vast subjects, but we will try to summarize some of the important points through today's class. So, we will begin by what Riffater and A.K. Ramanujan have done. Many people are familiar with the name of A.K. Ramanujan. He is one of the most widely known and renowned translator of poetry and prose in India. Right? He is one of the leading poets in Indian poets in English, but also a leading translator. We have seen that while Jackobson speaks about literary translation as an act of creative transposition of one poetic shape into another, remember that, right. So, what Jackobson said, that translation of poetry is not possible because it involves word play, right, and it is self-referential. So, that it does not refer to anything other than its own structure of communication, own semiotic system. So, you cannot really transfer it, it is by definition untranslatable. That is what Jackobson says, and only a transposition is possible. Now, when you say that something is by definition untranslatable, you are contradicting your own position. So, Jackobson contradicts his own position, because he has said that translation is always possible. You can always communicate something in another language, right. It may not be word to word explanation. Equivalent of word jalebi may not exist in English, but you can still explain what is jalebi in English, right. You have to resort to all kinds of circumlocutions. You can also show photos of jalebi. So, idea that experience is incommunicable is a contradiction in Jackobson's own thought. Okay. So, Michael Riffater, a very famous French semiotician, would develop a theory of literary translation based on Jacobsonian frames, right. And he argues, Riffater argues, that while translating a literary text, you do not just translate words, not primarily words, but you translate the lang, not the parole, right. Parole is not primary in translation, but lang is what you need to translate, and it is the intertextual system of signs, the grammar, the internalized poetics is what is important while translating. So, when you are translating, say for example, Japanese haiku into Gujarati, right, you have to find the ways to which by which you can make the poetics explicit, what he calls the presupposed tableau explicit and complete, right. And what do you mean by that? Because if you look at Japanese haiku, then it is written in fixed number of syllables, right, in a vertical manner, because Japanese language does not go from left to right as Gujarati does, but in vertical manner. Now, how will you reproduce that in Gujarati? You can't, right, but you can definitely reproduce the number of syllables, right. You can also adopt the conventions of a haiku, like say for example, the haiku should refer to nature, right, and it refers to some moment which is significant, and so on. So, you can transfer some presuppositions of haiku into Gujarati, and there are some conventions that we cannot transfer. So, you have to make that explicit, and this is something that we can call a formalist approach to literary translation, or you can say structuralist approach to translation, because structure is more important than the words, right. Okay. So, something similar is followed by A.K. Ramanujan in his seminal essay on translating Tamil poem, and in his translation of ancient Tamil Sangam poetry that you find in his superb book called Interior Landscape. And what he is doing is that he is trying to mimic sentence structure in Tamil or in Gujarati, which is left branching, right, into English, which is right branching. What do we mean by left branching and right branching? Is in English, when we say the man from Chicago, right, would be you are going towards right from left, but in Gujarati, Chicago thi avelo manas, right. So, Chicago goes towards left. In English, man from Chicago goes to right. So, English is a right branching language. Gujarati and Tamil are left branching. So, how can you reproduce those effects in English, right, because they are mirror opposite languages in terms of structures. So, he tries to mimic this left branching nature of Tamil in English, which creates kind of strange effects, and these effects can be understood as producing defamiliarizing effects on the readers of English translations of Tamil poem. So, he is almost Tamilifying English, right, syntactically, Indianizing English, and this kind of strategy produces a different kind of aesthetic effect through the experience of defamiliarization. And some of you may be aware that the idea of defamiliarization is one of the most important ideas of Russian formalism, as propounded by Viktor Shloviskij. But this is the structuralist approach to the literary practice of literary translation. Umberto Eco is another very famous scholar who has critiqued Eco. He has critiqued Jackobson by saying that idea that translation is explication and interpretation is a very broad idea. It lacks specificity, that what happens specifically in translation is something that Jackobson fails to comment on. And so, he draws upon the ideas of a Danish linguist called Louis Jemslev, and Jemslev has developed Saussurean signifier signified dichotomy into fourfold distinction, and Jemslev says that signifier is plane of expression and signified is the plane of content. Now, these two levels are subdivided. So, the plane of expression or plane of signifier is subdivided into expression form and expression substance, and similarly the plane of content or plane of signified is also divided into two, content form and content substance. And he would go on, Eco would go on to point out that how translation, especially literary translation, is a distinctive form of interpretation. Not all interpretation is literary translation, right, because the category is so broad that it covers everything. I am talking to you just now, that is also an act of translation, intralingual translation. So, what is specific aspect of translation is something that Jackobson has not talked about, and Eco argues that in rewording the content may remain the same, but the substance of the content changes. So, if you call cat as Felis catus, right, the meaning may remain same, but it is not the same. So, substance of expression is as important as the substance of content, and that is very important theory. But even then he seems to be continuing the idea that is at the heart of formalist structuralist approach to literary translation, and this idea is that literary or poetic language is completely different from everyday language. this formalist assumption is something that is also there in Eco's theory of translation. So, now this kind of binarism is something that is questioned by post structuralist philosophers like Jacques Derrida, and Derrida argues that this binaristic construction in structuralism is a metaphysical one, where one element of a binary is considered as self sufficient, autonomous, while other is considered as derivative or secondary or inferior. So, look at binary between original and translation, and Derrida would point out that there are elements of translation even in the original, so called original, and original depends as much on translation as translation depends on the original. So, it reminds me of very famous statement by Borges, Jorge Luis Borges, a very famous Latin American writer, who says that it is the job of original to remain faithful to translation, not the other way around. So, Derrida's critique is critique of this binary, where original is put up on the pedestal while the translation is put at the secondary or inferior or a derivative place. So, Derrida is attacking this metaphysical idea through his deconstructive approach, and you can find many of his arguments in his seminal essay called De Tour de Babel, where he questions Jackobson's distinction between intralingual translation and interlingual translation by arguing that the boundaries between languages are not always clear cut and rigorous, which means you cannot really pinpoint where one language ends and other begins. Right. At the same time, one language may have multiple languages within. For example, Gujarati may have multiplicity of languages like Kathiawadi Gujarati, South Gujarat Gujarati, Bhavnagari Gujarati, so on and so forth, Bolis as we say. So, one Gujarati itself is made up of multiple Gujaratis. So, a text is itself a multilingual construct even if it is written in one language. So, when you translate, how do you then understand the question of equivalence or synonymy or interpretation and explication? So, Derrida is questioning this tripartite division distinction made by Jackobson in his essay. So, what we discussed in this course of 3 lectures is first, why is Jackobson's theory important for a student of translation, and how he intervenes by broadening our understanding of translation beyond the level of word to word synonymy or exact idea that is equivalent. And because he also critiques the Sapir-Whorf thesis, right, and because his legacy continues in the theorists of literary translation like A. K. Ramanujan or Umberto Eco or Michael Riffater and so on. And in the last lecture, we also saw how Derrida and post-structuralists have questioned these binaristic assumptions that underlie structuralist formulations of Jackobson, right. So, in the course of these 3 essays, we have touched 3 classes, we have discussed these 3 important aspects of this essay. So, I now recommend you to read that essay in detail, and as a translator, if you are translating, then you can see how that helps you. This broader reformulation of translation helps you to become a better translator. So, this is where I want to end my classes, and I want to end by thanking Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University for giving me an opportunity to speak about subject that is very close to my heart, and that is the theory of translation. So, thank you very much.